Have you ever wondered what really happened behind the cameras of classic American television? Not the polished smiles, not the rehearsed monologues, but the moments that never made it onto the broadcast, the comments, the beliefs, and the attitudes that would get someone instantly canceled today. Because for decades, one of the most beloved shows in American history was also a revolving door of guests who carried shockingly racist, bigoted, or openly segregationist views. And the wildest part? Millions tuned in and clapped for them every single night. These weren't fringe figures or forgotten names. These were icons, Hollywood legends, political powerhouses, and cultural heroes, whose darker beliefs were quietly swept under the red carpet. Tonight, we're going deep into the truth television never told you. This is the side of history nobody warned you about. And by the end of this video, you'll see some of your favorite classic celebrities in a way you never imagined. John Wayne, the Hollywood icon, who said the quiet part out loud. John Wayne is perhaps the most revealing example of how deeply racism was woven into old Hollywood, not because he tried to hide it, but because he believed it was normal enough to say aloud. When he appeared on talk shows throughout the 1960s and 1970s, he carried with him a public image built around rugged heroism, patriotism, and traditional American masculinity. But every time he opened his mouth, something slipped that exposed a worldview rooted in white supremacy, cultural dominance, and a belief that his version of America was the only version that mattered. What made Wayne's racism so startling was not that it existed, many stars of his generation shared similar views, but that he proudly broadcasted it with zero hesitation, almost as if he were doing the world a service by saying the hard truths. He famously told Playboy in 1971, "I believe in white supremacy," and that same tone followed him onto late-night stages where hosts like Johnny Carson, who typically tried to keep interviews light, visibly tensed whenever Wayne drifted into politics. What audiences never saw was how producers scrambled backstage when Wayne went off script. Former staff members later recalled moments when he dismissed indigenous people as backwards, reduced black civil rights activists to troublemakers, and joked about the need to civilize non-white cultures. This wasn't just private prejudice leaking out. This was an ideology he had fully integrated into his public persona. When Carson asked him once about rising diversity in film, Wayne responded with a tone suggesting moral decay, claiming Hollywood was giving too much responsibility to people who aren't ready for it. In his mind, talent was directly linked to whiteness. Progress, to him, was a threat. Equality was a disease slowly eroding the America he believed belonged exclusively to his people. What deeply disturbed modern viewers isn't merely what John Wayne said, but how audiences reacted at the time. Instead of outrage or accountability, viewers laughed along. Studio audiences cheered, hosts nodded politely, and newspapers framed him as a straight shooter who told it like it is. The culture rewarded him for it. His presence on a talk show meant comfortable ratings, and networks had no interest in challenging a man whose films had generated billions of dollars by glorifying white heroism and sanitizing genocide. But time has a way of revealing what applause once concealed. Watching old clips today feels like staring into a parallel universe, one where racism was not only socially acceptable, but marketable. John Wayne wasn't an outlier. He was a mirror reflecting the beliefs of a nation still terrified of equality. And even though he's been dead for decades, his legacy continues to inspire debate about whether separating art from artist actually makes sense when the art was often propaganda for racial hierarchy. His talk show appearances expose a truth that history textbooks often gloss over. Racism didn't operate in the shadows. Sometimes it walked right onto a national stage, smiled at the camera, and spoke confidently into the microphone. Bob Hope, When Jokes Became Weapons, disguised as comedy. Bob Hope is often remembered as one of America's greatest comedians, a master of timing, delivery, and effortless crowd handling. But beneath his polished veneer of harmless humor lived something much darker, a brand of comedy built heavily on racial stereotypes, lazy caricatures and punchlines that dehumanized entire cultures. While today's comedians face intense scrutiny for even mild missteps, Hope was given a golden stage with no accountability. His Tonight Show appearances are filled with jokes that audiences at the time celebrated, but that now read like a historical record of normalized racism packaged as light entertainment. What made Bob Hope particularly complex wasn't just the content of his jokes, but the power he held. When Hope made fun of Asian people, he wasn't punching up. He was reinforcing an image that echoed throughout the United States, shaping public perception at a time when most Americans had limited exposure to other cultures. He'd mimic accents, exaggerate features, and reference stereotypes so deeply rooted they predated his career by generations. Hosts like Carson let it slide because Hope was, without question, a superstar. Calling him out wasn't an option. He was untouchable, and he knew it. The most striking thing about watching these old interviews is how the audience reacts. They roar with laughter at lines that today would get a comedian canceled mid-sentence. Hope joked about African nations as if they were uncivilized playgrounds. He joked about Mexican immigrants as if they were punchlines instead of people. He portrayed Asian men as effeminate and submissive, Asian women as exotic objects, and indigenous cultures as relics stuck in time. Each of these jokes fed into damaging, widespread beliefs. Comedy wasn't just entertainment back then. It was a cultural weapon that shaped social attitudes. But perhaps the most disturbing part of Bob Hope's legacy was how he responded when younger comedians began pushing for more respectful portrayals. He dismissed them as too sensitive, claiming comedy was being ruined by political correctness, long before the phrase gained its modern meaning. He refused to evolve, insisting that people used to know how to take a joke, even as those jokes actively harmed real communities. Whenever Hope slipped into racial material during his Tonight Show appearances, you could sense a cultural divide between generations, with Carson caught awkwardly in the middle, wanting to maintain the show's comedic atmosphere, yet visibly aware that Hope's humor belonged to a fading world. Watching these moments today feels like a warning about how comedy can be used to reinforce power structures. Bob Hope wasn't just a comedian making edgy jokes. He was a man shaping the American worldview, and doing so with humor that normalized racism in a way that millions of people absorbed without ever questioning it. Time has not been kind to this part of his legacy, and for good reason. It forces us to confront a painful truth. Some of the biggest laughs in the past came at the expense of people who never had the power to speak back. Frank Sinatra, the crooner, whose private prejudices slipped into public moments. Frank Sinatra is a complicated figure, a man whose charm, talent, and cultural influence made him one of the most beloved entertainers of the 20th century. But the public often forgets that behind the velvet voice and suave persona was a man deeply shaped by the racial attitudes of his era. While Sinatra sometimes publicly condemned racism, especially later in life, his earlier talk show appearances and behind-the-scenes behavior revealed prejudices that reflected a much more conflicted and uncomfortable truth. Sinatra's relationship with race was inconsistent, sometimes progressive, sometimes regressive. In some interviews, he spoke boldly in support of civil rights. In others, he mocked minority cultures or dismissed racial concerns as exaggerations. When he sat on the couches of shows like The Tonight Show, he occasionally drifted into comments or jokes about immigrant groups, African Americans, and Asian cultures that revealed a pattern. Sinatra wanted to appear enlightened, but only when it didn't threaten the comfort of his mostly white audience. One recurring theme in his talk show appearances involved mocking accents. He'd slip into exaggerated impressions of Chinese, Japanese, or Italian immigrants, expecting the audience to laugh, and they did. What stands out today is the subtlety. Sinatra wasn't as explosively racist as others on this list. Instead, his prejudice came wrapped in charisma. That made it more palatable to audiences, but also more insidious. People accepted it because they admired him. Hosts rarely challenged him. not only because he was a superstar, but also because he was known for having a volatile personality. Guests who pushed him risked being blacklisted from future opportunities. What adds an unsettling layer to Sinatra's story is how he handled black musicians in private versus how he discussed them in public. Sinatra did frequently collaborate with black artists. But when cameras weren't rolling, colleagues reported moments where he used racial slurs casually or dismissed issues of discrimination as things people blow out of proportion. During one interview, when Carson asked a seemingly harmless question about cultural changes in America, Sinatra commented that some groups push too fast, a phrase rooted in the idea that minorities needed to wait their turn. Sinatra's Tonight Show appearances are a masterclass in how racism doesn't always appear loudly. Sometimes it shows up in the assumptions, the dismissive tone, the jokes slip between sips of whiskey. Watching old clips today forces modern audiences to grapple with the fact that even the icons we idolize weren't untouched by prejudice. Sinatra remains beloved, but the full truth of his character, including the parts whitewashed from documentaries, reveals a man shaped by the racial contradictions of his time. Don Rickles, the insult comic who weaponized stereotypes for laughs. Don Rickles built an entire comedic legacy around the art of the insult. He was fast, sharp, unpredictable, and could dismantle an entire room with a single line. Millions adored him for it. To this day, people still refer to him as the undisputed king of insult comedy, a man whose brand of humor seemed to transcend boundaries and generations. But beneath the surface of the harmless roasting persona was a performer whose material frequently leaned on racism disguised as comedy. And once you watch his Tonight Show appearances through a modern lens, the truth becomes difficult to ignore. Many of Rickles' most celebrated jokes didn't merely push boundaries, they crossed into territory that demeaned and dehumanized the very groups he claimed to love. Rickles prided himself on insulting everyone. That was his defense, his shield, and his selling point. He mocked white celebrities, Jewish guests, politicians, rich people, poor people, the audience. No one escaped his crossfire, but insults don't exist in a vacuum. When he targeted white celebrities, the jokes felt playful, almost affectionate. But when Rickles targeted minority groups, the dynamic changed entirely. His Asian jokes relied on mocking accents, physical traits, and outdated stereotypes of submissiveness or strangeness. His comments about African nations framed them as primitive or uncivilized, echoing colonial narratives that had shaped Western entertainment for decades. His references to indigenous people came straight from old Hollywood Western tropes: savagery, feathers, war cries, broken English. The laughter that followed wasn't just laughter at a joke. It was laughter at the normalization of centuries-old prejudice. What makes Rickles so complicated is that he insisted his racism was harmless. Over and over, he dismissed criticism with phrases like, "Relax, it's comedy," or "You know I love everybody." In his mind, affection excused impact, intent erased harm. But that mindset ignored the power dynamics embedded in his act. Rickles performed in an era where white comedians could say nearly anything about marginalized groups without facing consequences, because the people they mocked had no platform to push back. His Tonight Show appearances weren't two-way conversations. They were monologues directed at groups who weren't in the room, couldn't defend themselves, and were represented only through caricatures he created on the spot. Some defenders argue Rickles was simply a product of his time, but that explanation falls apart under closer inspection. There were many artists in his generation, comedians, actors, musicians, who refused to rely on racial humor even when it was the norm. Rickles didn't reluctantly follow the crowd. He built an empire on pushing racial boundaries farther than most dared. His act was considered groundbreaking, not because it elevated comedy, but because society was structured to protect men like him, men whose privilege allowed them to mock marginalized groups while facing no real consequences. Modern viewers often experience a strange conflict when watching Rickles. His comedic timing was undeniably brilliant. His speed, his improvisation, his fearlessness, all of it remains impressive. But talent doesn't erase the weight of the stereotypes he reinforced. Every time he made a joke about Asian accents, the laughter that followed validated those stereotypes in millions of American homes. Every time he reduced African cultures to primitive caricatures, he helped solidify racist ideas that already shaped public perception. Comedy is one of the most powerful tools in media. It can heal or harm, challenge or reinforce. Rickles wielded that power recklessly, even if he didn't perceive it that way. His legacy remains deeply contested. Some insist he meant no harm, and that intention matters most. Others argue that being a product of your time doesn't absolve anyone who repeatedly chooses to punch down. What is clear is this: Don Rickles exposed a fundamental truth about American entertainment, that racism could be celebrated, monetized, and defended as long as it came packaged in laughter. And the fact that his Tonight Show clips are still aired without disclaimers or edits highlights something uncomfortable. Even now, society struggles to confront the line between humor and harm, especially when the harm was delivered by someone audiences were taught to adore. Milton Berle, the TV pioneer who used race as a cheap gag. Milton Berle is often remembered as Mr. Television, a charismatic pioneer who helped shape the early years of American broadcasting. But behind the applause, the pioneering sketches, and the historic rise of his shows, there exists a far more troubling truth, one that history is only now beginning to confront with full honesty. When it comes to race, Berle represents one of the darkest chapters in early comedy, not because he occasionally dipped into the era's biases, but because he fully embodied and amplified them. His performances, from his early vaudeville days through his Tonight Show guest appearances, reveal a pattern of racial caricatures, blackface routines, and ethnic mockery that was not merely a reflection of the times, but a deliberate personal choice that shaped the culture of television for generations. During the 1930s and 1940s, Berle performed blackface frequently, portraying African Americans as dim-witted, childlike, and servile. These weren't isolated acts or one-time lapses in judgment. They were repeated staples of his act, sketches he proudly performed, defended, and even refined. While some entertainers of that era were pressured into minstrel-style performances by studios and stage managers, Berle participated enthusiastically, treating these routines as comedic highlights. And although these acts predated the Tonight Show era, they formed the bedrock of his comedic worldview, a worldview he carried with him into later mainstream television appearances long after the rest of society had begun moving away from such blatant racism. When Berle appeared on talk shows, including The Tonight Show, he often slipped seamlessly back into these old routines, recycling stereotypes as if they were harmless relics of nostalgia. He mocked Asian accents, belittled black athletes, and portrayed ethnic minorities as punchlines rather than real people. What made these moments especially disturbing was not simply that Berle said them, it was that the hosts laughed, the band chuckled, and the audience roared. The normalization was complete. The harm, invisible to the cheering crowd, was absorbed by entire generations watching at home. The message was subtle but powerful. Racism was entertainment, and if a legend like Berle was doing it, then it was acceptable. Berle often defended himself by claiming he came from a different time, a phrase used by many of his contemporaries as a shield against criticism. But that explanation falls apart under scrutiny. Plenty of performers from his era refused to participate in racist comedy, rejected blackface, and spoke out against minstrel traditions even when it meant risking their careers. Berle didn't just go along with the culture, he reinforced it. He chose these routines, built an empire on them, and continued to profit from them, even as society gradually recognized the damage they caused. His legacy in early television created a blueprint for decades of racial stereotyping. Because he was one of the first major stars to dominate the TV screen, his influence stretched far beyond a single show or decade. Writers, producers, and younger comedians absorbed his style, mimicked his rhythms, and repeated his caricatures, sometimes consciously, often unconsciously. because they were taught that this was what comedy was supposed to look like. And when Berle appeared on The Tonight Show in later years, framed as a beloved elder statesman of entertainment, it only reinforced the idea that racism was woven into the very DNA of American humor. Watching these old clips today is jarring, not just because of the content, but because of how casually people accepted it. It serves as a stark reminder that the pioneers of television left behind more than groundbreaking programming and iconic moments. They left behind a legacy of normalized prejudice, wrapped in laughter and applause. And understanding this part of Berle's history isn't about erasing accomplishments. It's about acknowledging the full truth behind a man whose influence defined an era, for better and for much, much worse. Jerry Lewis, the comic genius, whose racism was hiding in plain sight. Jerry Lewis is often remembered as one of America's greatest comedic innovators. On The Tonight Show, Martin often recycled the kind of jokes that had worked for him during the variety show boom of the 1950s and 60s. Sometimes he joked about tribal Africans in ways that echoed colonial stereotypes, portraying them as primitive or uncivilized. Other times he poked fun at Asian cultures, using tropes about accents, strictness, or strangeness. Indigenous people also appeared in his jokes as part of outdated cowboy and Indian setups that treated native identity as nothing more than a prop for punchlines. These weren't jokes rooted in clever observation or satire. They were shortcuts, tapping into cultural myths that had been normalized in Hollywood for decades. Unlike Don Rickles, whose comedy was loud, abrasive, and aggressively confrontational, Martin delivered his more problematic material with a softness that made it deceptively palatable. He smiled, he winked, he took small sips of his drink. He never seemed mean-spirited or harsh, and that subtlety, the ability to make harmful stereotypes feel harmless, might have been what made the impact even more dangerous. When someone gentle and beloved makes a joke at the expense of a marginalized group, it reinforces the idea that mockery is harmless and socially acceptable. It smooths the edges of racism until it becomes invisible, woven into the fabric of entertainment as though it has always belonged there. Martin was not hateful. Nothing in his public persona or personal accounts suggests malice. In many ways, he was a man shaped by the system he worked in, an industry that built its foundation on minstrel shows, blackface comedy, and ethnic caricatures long before he ever stepped into the spotlight. But being a product of the system doesn't erase the role he played in continuing it. By repeating racial tropes on national television, he contributed to a comedic environment where minority groups were rarely allowed to be the subjects of jokes, only the objects. Watching Martin's old Tonight Show clips today reveals something painful and important. Racism in media doesn't always come wrapped in anger, cruelty, or explosive language. Sometimes it comes dressed in a tuxedo, holding a glass of whiskey, delivered with perfect timing and a warm laugh. Sometimes it looks like a charming man entertaining millions while reinforcing ideas that made life harder for the people being laughed at. Dean Martin's legacy remains iconic, and rightfully so in many ways. His music, his style, his comedic timing, all of it shaped American entertainment. But his talk show moments serve as a reminder that even the gentlest humor can uphold racial hierarchies. And when audiences laugh without questioning why something is funny, they unintentionally help carry those hierarchies forward. Martin's charm made the world love him, but it also helped many overlook the people he made the world laugh at, people who never had the power, platform, or privilege to laugh back. So after hearing all of this, the question becomes impossible to ignore. How many of the stars we idolize today will future generations look back on with the same shock and disbelief? Because history has a habit of exposing what fame once covered up. The Tonight Show wasn't unique. Every era has its icons who rise to the top while hiding beliefs that age like poison. But understanding this isn't about digging up dirt. It's about recognizing how society changes, how morality evolves, and how entertainment often masks the uncomfortable truths behind the people we celebrate. If anything, these stories remind us that fame doesn't equal integrity, Applause doesn't equal innocence, and sometimes the people who shaped culture were also the people quietly hurting it. If you found this eye-opening, make sure you stick around, because the deeper you go into entertainment history, the more shocking the truth becomes, and trust me, we're just getting started.